Welcome to the Wealthy Speaker Podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to people who want to speak more as a way to build their income and grow their business.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm really excited about today. My name is Jane Atkinson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the author of The Wealthy Speaker and a coach and consultant to professional speakers. And you're on the line today with myself and the fabulous Patricia Fripp for the teleclass entitled Turning Your Training Treasures into Keynote Gold. As you've read in our promotion, my friend and associate Patricia Fripp is an award-winning speaker, sales trainer, and executive speech coach. She has received the Certified Speaking Award from the Hall of Fame and the Cabot Award from the National Speakers Association. In fact, in 1984, Patricia was the first woman president of the over 4,000-member NSA. Meetings and Convention magazine named her one of the country's 10 most electrifying speakers. What you really need to know is that Patricia Fripp is and has been one of the busiest speakers in North America for the past 20 years, and her clients ask her back again and again. And I'm really thrilled that she's squeezed us into her calendar to be with us today. So welcome, Patricia.
Well, thank you, Jane, and you know I would do anything for you.
Well, bless you. Thank you. So let's get right into it. We're going to follow our bullet points that we advertise. So let's start right out with the distinct differences between keynoting and training.
Bill Gove, the first president of the National Speakers Association, said to me years ago, the seminar comes from the discipline of teaching, and the keynote comes from the discipline of show business. Don Thoren, who is a past president of the National Speakers Association and a great trainer, someone who spent years delivering 3 and 4 days training, said, Patricia, as a keynote speaker, you are the star. In a training or seminar, you have to make the audience the star. So they are the basic differences between the philosophy. A keynote, being more of a showbiz experience, has to have a higher caliber of performance. And the fact that we have less time, if you think most keynote speeches are probably booked for an hour, and in reality you're probably going to deliver 45 or 50 minutes, everything has to be edited to a nub. Also, a major difference between a keynote and training is that the information is probably delivered at a higher level of abstraction. In other words, there's less actual specifics. However, I believe that audiences are very frustrated when an audience does not receive some actual specific action plans and examples from a speaker delivering a keynote.
Great. So a lot of people on the line are probably great trainers right now. What is the quickest, most effective way to design your keynote?
Sit down to design your keynote with all your notes from your seminar around you. And start with a premise or a central theme or a big idea. What is your training teaching? And once you get the premise, and try and write your premise statement in a way that would lead the audience to think how or why. How I prepare a keynote, if this is helpful for our listeners, is on a yellow pad or on a flip chart, I will list all the stories that I want to use, all the talking points I want to include, or perhaps the talking points my clients are asking for. You have to be messy, so you have this all over the place. And once you come up with the premise, everything falls into place. For example, if we were talking about presentation skills, which we are now, my premise, and sometimes I state it, sometimes it's just from my preparation, might be, every speaker launcher client can deliver a keynote speech. The audience would think, how? So the answer is by understanding and implementing the 3 ingredients that go into every keynote speech.
Right.
The audience would think, what are they? The structure, the content, and the delivery. When you deliver a speech, and this would also be true with training, Jane, it's almost as if you're having a conversation with the audience. The difference between a keynote and training is with a keynote, if you have an audience of 2,000, the conversation is in their mind. Therefore, if you say something profound or interesting or funny or dynamic, give the audience time to think. Whereas in a training, if you posed a provocative question, they might actually ask you, because it's a smaller group, you allow the audience in a keynote to think the question and then you answer it. So once you have your premise statement, every speaker, launcher, client can deliver a dynamic keynote, or every treasury professional can sell themselves and their idea to upper management, or every American payroll association manager can create more creativity in the payroll department. Then the hows and the whys become the talking points throughout your speech. This is the basic, simple structure. And with each talking point, you think, what examples, what stories, what statistics, what case histories, and then what action would I recommend that they take. So this becomes a chunk of material with each talking point. If this were a seminar, perhaps you would then, at the table or with the group, discuss the action plan. You might ask them specifically, how has this worked in your department or your company? Whereas in a keynote, you can't do that. The chunking session and the structure can be used the same in a seminar. Then, when you've got your structure and you put together the stories and the examples and the case histories, then you rehearse it conversationally. I personally rehearse walking around Golden Gate Park or on a treadmill, because when you're moving, even if you're just walking around your office, there's something about the left brain, right brain. You can see structure and the creativity of your language.
Rather than standing in front of a mirror.
Well, yeah, that doesn't personally work for me.
Okay.
As the nature of a seminar or training, the biggest frustration for most trainers will be, I don't know how I can say anything worth listening to in 50 minutes. Well, of course you can. If you took the 3 or 4 best ideas for your training, if you took the very best stories and examples, and perhaps, Jane, you even want to tell a story about, when I deliver this in training, the participants usually debate and ask me this. So as a keynote, you can actually sell your training by telling a story about what happens when they're in your training sessions.
So the 3 main points you had brought up at the beginning there: structure, content, and delivery.
Yes. So, and the structure starts with your premise and your talking points to make your case. Then you add the content, your stories, examples, and then you rehearse. I am talking to you at the moment, Jane, as you know, from Las Vegas. And every Las Vegas singer will tell you, you start and you close your set with your best songs. A keynote speech, you have to start on a high and close on a high. And if you have your audience for 4 hours or 4 days, you might think you have the luxury of waffling around. Even when I deliver a 2-day or 4-day seminar, I always start with a high. Let us imagine you are a seminar leader giving your training and there's no one to introduce you. Handle all the housekeeping, take a break, and then start on a high. Or start on a high, and then when you've proved to the audience this is going to be fun and dynamic and entertaining, then do the housekeeping. with a keynote, you have got to come out and grab the audience. I compare the opening of a keynote to the opening of a movie. And the opening of a movie is called the flavor scene. And that's when, Jane, you go to the movies and you listen to you see the opening and you elbow your spouse or your date or your friend and say, this is going to be good. That's the importance of the opening for the keynote.
I love that you study so many other areas so that you can translate that into the speaking business. So movies and singers, and there's so much to learn out there from other industries.
Well, if you consider the keynote speech, if we accept what Gove says, which I always have, that it comes from the discipline of show business, it's very interesting to watch a singer and see how they work the stage, to study screenwriting, because Hollywood knows how to emotionally connect with an audience the way very few people do. Also, studying copywriting, not only to sell our seminars and keynotes, but to also learn the power of the words, because a good advertising slogan tells a story in one sentence. Again, probably a frustration for seminar leaders is with a keynote speech, you have to edit everything down to a nub. And my recommendation is, once you have your outline, talk into a tape recorder. Listen to it back and perhaps have it transcribed. Then literally look at it on paper and see where you can edit your remarks. And my advice is always, when you're learning your presentation or the new edited dynamic version of your presentation, is to use shorter sentences. As a speaker, as a seminar leader or trainer, we all speak to be remembered and repeated. And you will be remembered and repeated with shorter sentences, with pictures, very visual stories, and what I call soundbite statements. So again, if a seminar leader or trainer looks at what are the key learning lessons, the key messages, and come up with what are the slogans or the bumper sticker statements or the soundbite statements that would go with the stories. So between the structure, the pausing, the conversational approach, the stories and the soundbite statements, your audience will remember. A specific example, because perhaps everyone would like to write down specificity builds credibility. So even though your keynote is delivered a higher level of abstraction, you still need to have specifics. I was in Las Vegas a couple of years ago, just been to a show. I'm in the ladies' room alone putting on my lipstick. Very attractive young woman along the counter looked over and said, "You're British, aren't you?" Which I thought was exceptionally insightful, as I hadn't said anything. Then she said, "You're Patricia Fripp. Life is a series of sales situations. The answer is no if you don't ask." She said, "I was in your FedEx audience 10 months ago in Orlando." And I said, "And when does the real sale come?" She said, "Patricia, the real sale comes after the sale." And I said, "And who is the first sale to?" She said, "Patricia, the first sale is always to yourself." I defy a keynote speaker, a trainer, or a seminar leader to meet an audience member in a different city in totally out of context when they're on vacation and be able to test them on the outline of the speech or the training.
That's fantastic.
That's how we have to speak to be remembered and repeated.
Okay.
In February, Jane, I had 3 speeches in a row. The first one, a committee member of a group in Fresno, had seen me 7 years ago. Next day, the the president of a company had seen me 7 years before. The next day, the sales manager had seen me 10 years ago. And they're now booking me this many years later. We have to be remembered not only to make a contribution to our audience and their lives, we also need to make a contribution to our own careers by being memorable.
Okay. So back to the opening for a second, would people use the idea of sound bites as soon as in the opening?
I recommend that usually the opening could be what I would call a soundbite statement. One time I used this with the Seventh-day Adventist pastors. And I like this as a specific example because what every speaker and trainer has to remember is that people read the write-up. It's one thing if they know you, Jane, they know your reputation, and they come to one of your events. If they're at a convention, or if their boss sent them, or if they don't know you and they're just coming because of the content we promised, they are walking in, and to a certain extent, their arms are folded, mentally, if not physically, thinking, prove to me this is going to be worth listening to. And with the Seventh-day Adventist pastors, I would expect even the most kind and generous audience to be thinking, she's the only person on the program who isn't a minister. Her subject is how to design and deliver a more dynamic sermon. How can anyone who isn't a minister tell me how to write a better sermon? I bet she isn't even a Seventh-day Adventist. That is the prejudice we have to overcome with our opening. So whether it's a story or a powerful quotation or a rhetorical question or an interesting statistic, little-known fact which might be considered a soundbite statement, we have to just come out punching. And in that case, I walked out and said, 465 times in the Bible, it said it came to pass. It did not say it came to stay. And unless your sermon is well constructed, artfully crafted, and charismatically delivered, it will not come to stay in the hearts, minds, and lives of your congregation. That is what I call a little-known fact from the audience's world, not yours, which is a great way to come out and grab the audience. I hope everyone will notice that I obviously did not make that up as I was walking on stage.
Right.
And when anyone says, I'm giving an important presentation tomorrow, I always say, what's your opening line?
Right.
And if the day before they don't know, it's, come on. It's not that you won't win the audience over if you waffle around for the first few minutes. It's going to be a lot more difficult, though.
So you even thought about, with those ministers, what objections they might be having in their head as you walked up there. You had thought that through, so you thought, what do I need to say to them that will automatically turn the skeptics around?
I always try it, Jane, and think, what would the skeptics be thinking, and turn them around. In that case, I wish I could admit to it being more logical. I had that statistic.
Okay.
And I realized this will be a perfect way, and I knew, based on the fact that everyone else on the program was a minister, obviously, being a kind, generous audience, they would think that somebody who booked her thinks she's worth listening to.
Right.
I would expect they would not be eating out of my hand before I start as perhaps a National Speakers Association chapter, or someone who knew who I was in advance would do.
Well, because we're doing so well in the program, how about we open up and just take a couple of quick questions here?
Okay, that's fine with me.
To keep things moving, we'll just go ahead and take two very short and sweet questions. So go ahead and say your name first and your question.
Hi, my name is Candace Asher. Patricia, Jane, hello. You talked so well about openings. Would you say something, please, about closing?
Thank you very much. Yes, with closing, Candace, I would recommend you always go back to your opening when you are writing your close, the best advice is think, where were you at the beginning? For example, if it was a story, or if you go to your premise or your point of view, do a review and then close on a high, and it might be the circle technique, which is something else that ties into the same thought that was in the opening. Perhaps everyone would like to write down LLL. No, wrong, LWW. No, forget what you, last words linger. This is a woman who can't spell, obviously. Last words linger.
LLWL.
Yeah, last words linger.
Okay.
When I use these techniques for sales presentations, I often say you can close, and then you have what I call the Columbo PS close. You finish your sales presentation, you finished, and this would also work with a keynote speech. And then it's almost as if you're walking out of the room like Columbo did, and then turn around, and Peter Falk would always say, one more question. You have a chance for a short bullet. In a sales presentation, it might be, remember, 99% of the Fortune 100 do business with us. Or, if it were in a seminar, you might say, presentation skills will set you apart from your competition. So you could do it that way. You finish and you close, and you have one final reaffirming thought that came out of the presentation.
Okay. So, one more question?
Thank you. Here's the question. If a keynote, say, has 3 key points, and each key point is going to be 15 minutes, how do you construct that 15 minutes? What are the components that go into that 15 minutes? You've got a story. Could you walk me through a mini outline of that portion?
A mini outline. Well, let's just say your subject might be selling yourself and your ideas. Let's just, as a hypothetical. So you might say you have to sell yourself internally to your management. You sell yourself in your industry at a networking event, and then perhaps you want to sell yourself when you have the opportunity perhaps to speak at your company meeting. Let's just take one of these points. So one of the points is you sell yourself when you're networking. Then you could have sub-points. For example, one might be, let's look at how is your self-introduction. So you might give an example of your own self-introduction. Then you might give an example of other people's self-introductions. A good self-introduction, a bad self-introduction. Then you might say another way that you network to sell yourself is to what I would call travel with your own PR agent. And I would tell an example of how Susan Rowan and I naturally say things about each other that you wouldn't say about yourself. And so you've now got 2 sub-points with examples from your main point, and then you would take a third one and give some specific examples. That might be one way. You might have one idea. I've heard the motivational type speech. Florence Littauer gave a great speech on silver boxes, and silver boxes was a metaphor of how you have to give sincere compliments to other people. And her entire speech was that one idea, illustrated how you do it in your family, how you do it with strangers, how do you do it with people you know. So one idea with different specific applications. If you just took perhaps one idea, it might be on customer service. Then you might start, Roger, your first knock-down, drag-out story is one that you always use. It's one of your signature stories. Then let's just say you're talking to a retailing group. Then you might tell a story on customer service as it relates to you in a retailing situation, perhaps going to Nordstrom's. Then you might tell a story about how you walked into another store, same situation, your same question, and they didn't handle you as well. And then the last part of that chunk might be a story about how you became a mystery shopper for perhaps the company or the industry that you are speaking in. So in that case, your chunk has just one idea. Perhaps it's customer service as it relates to turning an inquiry into a sale. You've got your classic story, your story about that particular industry, and then perhaps that about the company. And when you're giving a specific story that you might have just created for that group, it doesn't have to be as word perfect as your signature story because it's so specific for them. Hope that's helpful.
Right. So thanks to Roger and Candace for stepping up there and asking some questions. What we're going to do until we get to the very end from here on in, if you have a question, go ahead and email it to me, jane@speakerlauncher.com, and we'll try to keep the questions on what we've covered so far, and then at the end we'll open it up to general questions about keynotes. So should we go ahead then, Patricia, and move right into storytelling?
Let's just give our audience just a couple more choices of openings, and then, because a keynote speech has to have stories, you're right, we should. So in your opening, you can start with an original and interesting story. You could start with a powerful quotation. However, if it's a quotation, it should not be overused. I am well known for saying, don't keep quoting dead white men. And it isn't that Ralph Waldo Emerson and Abraham Lincoln did not say wonderful, profound things that are worth repeating. However, if you start your presentation with something that the audience has heard before, it flavors that the presentation will not be new, cutting edge, and original. So if you're going to start with a quotation, I suggest it be something that the audience might not be familiar with. One of my favorites is, as the great philosopher Raquel Welch said, style is being yourself, but on purpose. And anytime you stand in front of an audience, you have to be yourself, however, very much on purpose. It might be a question. Now, this is one of my pet peeves. I hate speakers that walk out and say, well, you put up your hand if you want to make more money. The problem is, if you have a group who does not respond to you, then perspiration starts running down your back. So if you want to ask a question, I would ask you to ask it as a rhetorical question. So you might say, if I were to ask you, is this the year you are committed to make more money? Your answer would probably be yes. And in the next 45 minutes, we'll look at 3 specific inside secrets of increasing your income, or something like that. So it's something that it's a question they think about, and you don't need them to put their hands up,
right,
in case they don't.
Back to the expert for 1 second. Yeah. I always talk about, making other people the experts rather than you by quoting other people. Would it be appropriate to quote yourself, or how would you position that?
Well, you could certainly say, as the great philosopher Patricia Fripp says, and obviously that is something I have done on few occasions. What I would do is, let's just say, you have a similar idea as Tom Peters. So you don't want to give stories out of Tom Peters' books, but what you might say is, if you've read Tom Peters' latest book, you'll notice on page 56 he makes the very profound observation of such and such. As I read that, I realized I absolutely agree, and I first learned the lesson when I was 23 years old and I had a brilliant boss. So you quote Tom Peters and transition to your point of view on it.
Like that.
So that is a technique. You just want the audience to know that they are getting your wisdom, not a regurgitation of Tom Peters' latest book. Another way, of course, that we could start our presentation, which is the interesting statistics or little-known facts, or you can always tie into their theme. If you walked out, and I've done this on numerous occasions, and say, I love your theme, then, of course, you have to tell them why you do love their theme. A convention committee has probably spent 4 months coming up with that theme, and it's nice to have that acknowledged. So if we look now at some of the inside secrets of stories, stories need to have two formulas. Well, this is a great starting point. Situation, solution, success. So you think out, where is the start of the story? What happens? And what's the happy ever after? This is very good if you're giving examples, perhaps, of what companies did to increase sales. When I coach sales teams, I coach them on the success stories from the point of view of their customers. Then the other formula is what I call the Hollywood model. Characters, dialogue, and dramatic lesson learned. And if there is one lesson, and I first learned this from Bill Gove many years ago, that will transform your stories, it is to use dialogue. Don't report on the conversation, use the conversation.
Go into the storytelling mode.
Yes, if somebody was transcribing your speech, would they know where to put the quotation marks? And for an example, I tell a story. Let me tell you the way some people might and then the way I actually do. And you'll see the dialogue. 27 speakers and myself, we had our meeting and we went out for dinner. And after dinner, we decided like ice cream. So we went out to Baskin-Robbins just as they were closing, and one of my friends knocked on the door and offered the kid money to stay open. Well, they haggled a little bit, and we ended up paying them $30, and we got our ice creams. That isn't a story. This is how I tell it. 27 speakers and myself, we'd had our deliberations, we went out for dinner. And after dinner, we decided we'd like ice cream. So we turned up at Baskin-Robbins exactly 9 p.m. when the manager was turning around the closed sign. You could tell he was the manager, little white jacket and a cap. My friend knocks on the door and says, excuse me, 28 people for ice cream, 10 minutes work. The kid says, sir, we've closed. My friend looks through the glass door and thinks, 3 kids working for minimum wage, I'll make them an offer. He said, $30 for you 3 and the sale of 28 ice creams. They huddled, a focus group to study the problem. The kid comes back and said, could you make it $40? We settled for $30. However, as sales trainers, we really appreciated that he tried to get more, because that young man realized 2 things we must never forget. 1, life is a series of sales situations, and the answer is no if you don't ask. Even when your characters think, do it in dialogue. My friend thought, 3 kids working for minimum wage. And it's the dialogue that makes it a story. Then give your characters a backstory. Let the audience see your characters. I often start my presentation with a story about Larry Mariottini. And it starts with, I'll never forget the first time I met Larry Mariottini. It was 10:45 on a Tuesday in 1972. I walked into the lobby of this very shishi men's hairstyling salon where I worked, and there he sat, looking most uncomfortable. Somebody had said to him, "You need Miss Fripp." Well, he didn't know if he needed Miss Fripp, but he was there. Larry Mariottini was a computer programmer for Levi Strauss. I guess you might say Larry was a nerd long before I knew what one was or ever dreamed I would want to grow up and be one. Now, the story goes on. And what I often do, Jane, with a 3-hour seminar or an all-day seminar, at the end of the presentation, just when we're talking about something else, I'll say, what year did I meet Larry Mariottini? Where was it? What time of the day? What day of the week? What did Larry do for a job? So if you think, if this were a screenplay, what would the instructions be? Location, Shishi Hairstyling Salon. Time, 1972, 10:45 in the morning. And it's important. My bio says, I'm a speech coach, blah, blah, blah. That's not where she started. And part of our introductions, the subtext, if our audiences think we always knew what we're now teaching, what's the hope for them? So it's very important for my audience to know who I am today. However, I started as a hairstylist. And because my opening story ties into the last line of my introduction, I want them to know this is a long time in the past. Otherwise, the audience will be elbowing their neighbors and saying, oh, does she still cut hair? And it's amazing how vividly the audience sees Larry Mariottini. He's always got a pocket protector and slicked down hair or long hair or facial hair. However they see him, it doesn't matter what he really looked like. They see their own picture because he has just a short backstory, a computer programmer for Levi Strauss.
Now, so you don't even, did you make up his name? Because
no,
even
his
name is brilliant. I mean, Larry Brown.
I love saying his name, yes.
So wouldn't you say that there is a little bit of creative license there in terms of, changing Larry Brown to Larry Mariottini?
Obviously, we have, as artists, creative license, and there might be times that you would change someone's name to make them funnier or to protect the innocent. That was Larry's name, and that is absolutely word for word true, the whole story. And people might say, well, was it really 10:45 on a Tuesday? And to be honest, I have no idea. However, it was early in my days when I worked at the Sebring Salon, and I had appointments at 10:45. So there's enough details that make it real. And as we're talking about the inside secrets of good stories, what we have to remember is what Alfred Hitchcock said. He said, movies are like life, with all the dull parts left out. And your story has to have enough details that I can see it, that I can feel it, but not be so long it's redundant. So your characters have to have a backstory. I was coaching LA weight loss counselors to use stories to sell. And I asked, who would like to tell me a story about the person who sent them the most business last year, the most referrals? Woman came up to the stage, and because I'm looking for characters and dialogue, I said, who was it? She said, John. That story is immediately more interesting to me, Jane, because I expected a woman to send her the most business.
Okay, good.
Then I said, and she said it's John. What was the first thing John said? She said he walked in at 6:30 on a Friday, just as we're about to close, and said, "Don't you ever dare tell anyone I was here." I believe the story is now more interesting because he sent her more business and he didn't want her to tell anyone he was there. And I said, what was John's job? Give him a backstory. And when she told me what he did for a living, I had two visual pictures. That's what I call verbal shorthand. And I knew how he sent her so much business. She said he's a fireman. I got a picture of this guy running into a burning building and throwing people like you and me over his shoulder. This is a manly man. Secondly, because I've seen enough TV shows, etc., I know that firemen work 24-hour shifts and they cook together. So I imagined him walk into the firehouse just as they were going to have dinner, stick out his chest, hit his stomach and say, "Hey guys, look at this new body. You need LA weight loss." That's the importance, Jane, of giving your characters a backstory, because the audience knows more than the amount of words. Then you tell the story with as much dialogue as possible, and your characters can very often fill in the backstory, and they have all the best lines. I was giving a speech for the Employee Involvement Association, and this is a group that their whole mission in life is to come up with programs to get their employees to come up with ideas that make or save the company money. And the chairperson was from Sprint. I said, "Do you have any success stories?" She said, "Yes. As a matter of fact, one of our women came up with a very simple idea. It's made us more than $15 million. So I said, "Who is it? What's her number? May I call?" So in a speech, this is how I would tell the story. And please notice how much dialogue there is. Nearly all the stories in dialogue, and it's Nancy's words. So I called up Nancy Albertson and said, "Nancy, just for my records, what's your title?" She said, "Patricia, I'm just a secretary. I guess you'd call me a big gal with big ideas." You see, Jane, when you ask people questions, they will write better dialogue than we could write for them. I said, "Nancy, tell me about your story." And the best technique I can recommend is when your characters are speaking, put your name in it. And it keeps you on track, and the audience knows the other person is speaking. So she said, "Patricia, as you know, we are a call center in Florida." Sidebar, did she actually say that? No, but I want the audience to know it. That's the background. Business is good, and one of our executives was here saying, "We're selling lots of phone lines, but sell more." And as he walked by my desk, I said, "Sir, I've got a good idea." He said, "Write it in so we can analyze it." And she said, "Patricia, what we had given my daughter, my teenage daughter for Christmas, was her own phone line. And we'd gone into her bedroom. When she was out, we put a jack behind her dresser and covered it up. So Christmas morning, we could pull back the dresser. There was the phone jack, gave her own phone." This is long before everyone had an extra line for modems. And she said, "So what I wrote in was, why don't we recommend all our clients give each teenager their own phone line?" And she said, "Patricia, that became a program called Teen Line, and it's already made more than $13 million. So I continue with it. But you can see that's the first part of the story, and it's nearly all in dialogue. And the very end of the story, when I'm saying, "What did you get?" she said, "Oh, Patricia, the people with the 10 best ideas, we dressed up, we brought our spouses, we had this great dinner, they videoed it, they gave us plaques, they gave us gift certificates." And I said, "Nancy, just between us girls, don't you ever fantasize? What if they gave you 1%? And she said, Patricia, we do fine. We make enough money. It is such an honor and a privilege to work for a company that actually cares what I think.
So you were even maybe saying what the audience might have been thinking at that point.
Well, I would
expect
if you were hearing a story, what do you get? You're excited about this gift certificate. What about having a percentage?
Right.
So I asked because, again, a speech is like a conversation with more drama.
Okay.
It has to be conversational. The difference between a conversation, of course, is we talk at the same time, we start sentences we don't finish, that you don't really do in a keynote. My point is, though, I gave Nancy the punchline, the point of wisdom. And what starts with being a customized story from interviewing their board of directors and making these stories specific for that group, in fact, is a way to develop good material that has nothing to do with you. Because as a keynote speaker, you can't be the hero of all your stories. And most of my stories, I was there, I observed, I listened. I was not the hero.
And if it is your own personal story, there are ways to turn it around and make it about them.
If you're telling your own personal story, if it is your life story, then I personally believe it's important the audience knows that if you overcame an obstacle, you didn't do it alone. Or if you built a great business, somebody taught you some of the principles.
You're still making other people the heroes.
Well, you're making other people, or the universal principles are also the hero. There's a principle I talk about: tell the story of the war through the eyes of one soldier. So what we do as a speaker, we might be talking about this is how you build an entrepreneurial business, and we're doing it through the eyes of perhaps my business. So what we've just done, I've just told you a story of Nancy Albertson. So we're telling the principle of your story. Every speaker, launcher, client's stories will be better when they use dialogue. And through the eyes of Patricia's story about her conversation with Nancy Albertson, we see the principle. So I hope you don't think Patricia is the hero, because I learned this principle 20 years ago from Bill Gove. And the hero of this actual story was Nancy. And the principle is, the universal principle about how to have a dynamic keynote is use dialogue in your stories.
Here's one quick question, and then I want to get into the repeat business idea. Question from David McLaren. Could we use a video clip to supplement your main point in a keynote?
Oh, of course you can. Of course you can. The only problem we have to be very careful with, and I think that's really great, is rather like if you won the an Olympic medal and you have a video promo introducing yourself. You are, in fact, competing against yourself. And so you need to make sure that your performance, even though it's different, is as good as the video clip.
Okay. So if you were to use another type of video clip, maybe that isn't necessarily you, just realize that you must be better than whatever that was.
Well, the good thing, Jane, is that the enemy of the speaker is sameness. So the very fact that we have another medium within our speech makes it variety and therefore more interesting. Just be aware that although your performance is going to be different, it has to be of a compatible quality in some way.
Is there any formula? You know how in training they say every so many minutes you should change it up and do something different? Is there anything like that in keynoting? Every so many minutes you should switch it
Well,
up?
how about this? Every sentence should have some level of variety.
Okay. So
and if you think of this principle, and this is something I learned from my acting coach friend, Kay. She said, Patricia, words are $10 each. You have $30 for a sentence. And most sentences have more than 3 words. So that means not every word is a $10 word. So you emphasize some words more than the other. So 465 times in the Bible, it said it came to pass. It did not say it came to stay. So there is variety within one sentence based on emphasis. So yes, a keynote has a lot of variety. I wouldn't give you a formula. I'd just say be aware. The enemy of the speaker is sameness. And I first heard that from Ron Arden, great speech coach I worked with years ago. And I was speaking for the National Association of Catering Executives. I was closing their speech, closing their conference, and I was commenting on all the different breakout sessions. So I went to 5 different breakout sessions, a portion of each one over and over again, so I could see the beginning, the middle, and the end of all of them. And one really good-looking, attractive, well-dressed, dynamic, powerful woman who was a professional speaker in catering was one of the speakers. And I walked and I thought, this is an NSA-type crony person. She was high energy, she was wonderful, she was great. Went back again. She was still high energy, wonderful, and great. I went back the 3rd time, and something was wrong. And then I realized she was still high energy and dynamic and great. There wasn't enough variety in her presentation. And the 3rd time I went back, what I loved so much at the beginning was now boring.
Wow.
So the enemy of the speaker is if you are high energy, which obviously I am, that's great. But there are times when you want to be quiet and pause. And you want to be serious. And then you want to be funny. And then you want to move and stand still and go in the audience and come back to the stage. Variety, variety. So that's why the question, the video is good.
Okay.
Be aware it's also competition.
Because it's variety.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that we promised.
Yeah, how to get booked again and again and again.
How to get booked again and again. Let's hear it.
Find your connection to the audience. And whenever possible, do something for them that nobody else has done. And I learned this lesson years ago. I was on a program with George Morrissey. We were speaking for the National Recreational Association. And I gave a speech, very well delivered, well received. And then George got up, and George is a totally different type of speaker, perhaps not nearly as showbiz as Fripp. However, George had taken a day of his life and become a mystery shopper and talked about it. And that principle I'm so glad I learned early on. And one of my favorite examples of this was the Bartlett Tree Experts. When I was first booked to speak for them, my opening story, Jane, as I walked on stage was, so I called the Bartlett office in San Francisco and said, I need someone to come look at my trees, but I warn you, I'm not going to be a very big customer. I only have 2 trees. To which the young woman in Maryland who had worked in the San Francisco office for 1 month said, oh, madam, we don't have any little customers. Everyone's equally important to us. And I wish you could have been there. 1 o'clock on a Thursday in September, the day my very own Bartlett Tree Expert came to call. All right, my opening story has 2 people that are heroes from their company. I invested $195 having my trees fertilized. and I stole the show from my opening story. Then when I got a repeat booking, I said, well, I'm going to have to go out on the truck with the guys. So I go out with my Bartlett hard hat and T-shirt and work gloves and boots. I said, of course, you do have to bring a digital camera to prove it, to show the next time I do this. So this is one way you can do it. With the American Payroll Association that I've worked for every year, at least minimum 5 days since 1996, I tell stories about their payroll managers that I've interviewed. You make heroes of their people. So one, you obviously have to do a good job. Secondly, you have to say something within your presentation that was obviously written or produced just for them, not for anyone else. And at very least, interview people and put them within the presentation. On Sunday, I'm doing a 3-hour presentation skills training for a group. Well, the 5 or 6 people on the board, I have their quotes throughout my own program, which would emphasize my key points about the importance of this particular industry and these leaders being good speakers.
Well, we've got just a couple of minutes left. So, okay, if we go ahead and open it up for just a couple more questions.
Okay.
Patricia Morgan here.
Hi,
Hello,
Patricia.
Morgan.
Go ahead. Her name is Patricia Morgan.
Oh, Patricia Morgan. Okay, Patricia, great name.
Yes, we met in Montreal. My question is, what are the biggest mistakes we can make?
The biggest mistakes. Spending too much time preparing your script and not enough time rehearsing. As Michael Caine says, rehearsal is the work, performance is the relaxation. How about that one?
Okay. And who else has a question?
I've got one.
Go ahead.
It's Michelle Ray.
Hey, Michelle.
Well, hello, Michelle Ray.
Patricia, just very quickly, I have a client that has booked me to do a closing keynote, and they've allocated 90 minutes for it. And personally, I think that's borderline getting out of a keynote into something else. Do you think that I should say something to them, or do you think I should just let it go?
Your instincts are good. And what I would say to the client is, I appreciate the opportunity and that you are interested enough in my message and my performance to book me for 90 minutes. However, as the very last event of your convention, please trust my 15 years of experience. It is too long. We want to leave them on the high and use the Hollywood model of leaving them want them more. So let's do a 50-minute close, and you would be better off to do a slideshow from pictures of the convention. Leave them looking at themselves or something like that. But your instincts are right. It is just too long.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Hey, this will be our last one. Thanks a lot.
This is Cynthia Jordan, and I was wondering if Ms. Fripp could tell us if she has some advice on back of the room sales, on how to sell more product.
The best advice on back of the room sales, perhaps you want to give away some of your merchandise as prizes within the presentation. And my approach to selling is you do it throughout the presentation. You don't do it as a 5-minute sales pitch. So if you have an order form at the back table, you have a display, you give a few prizes, and then you do such a good job. The good thing about being a breakout session, I do not think, I get very offended if speakers trying to hawk their products too much in a keynote. In a breakout session, you can always say, well, some of you were generously asked about my merchandise, and just do 2 seconds and then say, if you're interested, I'll certainly see you at the back table. Don't make a big deal out of it. You're going to offend some people.
Well, I want to say thank you so much to Patricia Fripp for giving us her time and her wisdom. And Patricia, there's something, if people want more information from you, what should they do?
If you go to fripp.com, Fripp.com, look down the left navigation button to articles. There are hundreds and hundreds of free articles about the first 60 of the speakers, all free, help yourself. There are also a couple of special reports on the home page, the 10 traps, how to go from dull to dynamic. And yes, of course, there's information on my speaking school, my products, and my Odd Couple seminar with Alan White that you can click on. And what you might like to see is Bob Chesney of Chesney Communications has made these little video presentations of me where I basically sell what's on the page, which people might be interested in for themselves. And then one last piece of advice when it comes to marketing, whether you're marketing a speech, a seminar, training, or coaching. If you are the solution, what is the question? Because people probably are not looking for you, they're not looking for me. Obviously, we have past clients who are, but as a general rule, most of our future income will come from people who don't know us. What would people be Googling that you would be the answer? And make sure you have those keywords and phrases in the copy so you have a higher ranking in the search engines.
Good advice. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Patricia Fripp. We really appreciate your time. You can read about Patricia's story in my book, actually, The Wealthy Speaker, which is available on speakerlauncher.com.
Thanks for listening to The Wealthy Speaker Show. Please visit speakerlauncher.com for your free Wealthy Speaker audit, and visit speakerlauncher.com/podcast for show notes and many more resources to help you catapult your speaking business. See you soon, Wealthy Speakers.